it goes unnoticed. That's, there's nothing sadder, I think, in the scientific literature than a paper that's sitting out there all alone, uncited and unloved and unappreciated. So they're orthogonal to each other. And so somehow we have to learn as authors how to make those arrows line up together. So how, as an author, can I do what I need to do so that you will find my work valuable and interesting and engaging? How can I align what my activities are to align with the reader's goals? Because you can't expect the reader to change their perspectives. Just because you need to get your paper read and cited and highlighted doesn't mean that they need to bother wasting their time with it. You need to make them want to. So communication isn't about what you give, it's about what they get. Whatever message the reader gets is the message that you actually delivered. I hit the button. Okay. So writing is about what you do, but it's about readers. And that's something that we don't also train our people to think about all the way up through college and even through graduate school. We write papers to hand them in to get a grade, but we're not really thinking about how is someone going to assimilate this. We need to ask questions like these. Who are your target readers? What do they know? And what do they value? And the important question, how do I give that to them? So my principle here, and one of my great pet peeves in reading proposals is when people use the wrong principle for principal investigators with an LE. If you want to get your scores knocked down by about a notch, that's a good way to do it. It's the author's job to make the reader's job easy. But writing is not about dumping something on the page and then hoping the reader understands it. It's about making their job easy. And their job is never easy because what we do is hard. But making it as easy as is practical. So we can ask, why are science papers hard to read? Well, one reason is what we do is fundamentally hard. We've got complex thoughts to express. We've got new things to discuss. And one that's a real problem is the curse of knowledge. I know what I know, and it makes sense to me, but you don't know what I know. And so what I'm thinking and what seems obvious to me may not be obvious to you. So as an example of this, I'll use this ad I saw on Yahoo Life once that said, napkin tops are the risky fashion trend. Risky trend fashion people are actually pulling off. And I wondered, so should you call the fashion editor or should you call the police to report a sexual assault? What does pulling off actually mean? It could mean a number of things. And it's only obvious in context. Or another example I had of my own curse of knowledge problem was when the book was still fairly new and was showing up on Amazon's bestsellers lists. It showed up there at one point on Science for Kids. Now, Science for Kids also includes college textbooks, which made a little bit more sense. But I didn't think of the book as being a college level textbook even then. I aimed it for graduate students and working professionals. And it's like, why am I on the Science for Kids list? This just makes no sense to me. Until someone pointed out that I talk about how to write papers, and they probably translated that as term papers. And all books on science writing are all about scientific writing, as opposed to writing science. And so their algorithm sort of misinterpreted what the book was about, and I couldn't figure it out until someone actually twigged it for me. So what we do is hard, and one of the reasons for that is what's known as the ladder of abstraction, which is at the highest level are these big concepts that are pretty easy and pretty straightforward for people to manage. Oh yeah, I don't need to use there's not much of a pointer. So things like evolution by natural selection or nitrogen cycling, these are ideas that are easy to understand in their largest aggregated sense. At the bottom of the ladder of abstraction are the actual concrete details. So the shape of a finch's beak, what led Darwin to actually think about evolution, or how much nitrogen a crop plant took up. Those fall into nitrogen cycling, but they're concrete details, they're numbers, they're descriptions. The problem, of course, is what makes science writing hard is what we actually study is stuff in the middle. So like evolutionists talk about Hardy-Weinberg equilibria, which I've learned what that was once upon a time and then forgot, or net nitrogen mineralization. But these are concepts for experts. They're not things that are intuitively obvious, either as big, broad concepts or as nice, concrete details. You actually have to learn what these words mean to have them make any sense at all. Yet, for those of us working in these fields, they become second nature, and it just becomes a vocabulary that we readily throw around without realizing that there may be people reading this stuff who don't know what these words mean yet, and for whom they're not second nature. So it's the curse of knowledge problem where we assume that people know our jargon terms, and maybe they don't. So what we do is hard. And this is where we live as scientists. We live in these concepts for experts space. And again, I'll come back to my principal. It's the author's job to make the reader's job easy. And my core message of really everything that I have to say about writing science and communicating science always comes back to that writing science is telling stories about nature. Now, some academics get uncomfortable with the word of telling stories, but there's nothing inherently unobjective or unfactual about telling stories. Journalists think only about story, and good journalists are as objective and as fact-based as we are. I mean, they do error checking sometimes to levels that we actually don't. So writing science is telling stories about nature. And I saw this definition once of a paper in a website of what a scientific paper is. A scientific paper is a written report describing original research results. And my only answer to this is I think this definition is complete rubbish. I think it's misguiding it. I think it's misrepresenting what we actually do. Because if all you do is report research results on the flow from data to information to knowledge to understanding, we're aiming for there. We're aiming to understand the world. We generate raw data and we take it through this process. And if all you're doing is reporting research results, all you're giving me is information. And if you can't tell me what your information means or why it's important or interesting, it's not fair to expect me to try to have to figure it out on the fly. And yet we see lots of papers that basically are just giving us information. They're just giving us a report of studies they did. And in the journal I'm an editor on, Soil Biology, Biochemistry, those are the papers that we filter out at the triage stage because they're just not what we publish. We publish things that actually ask meaningful questions and are talking about interesting new ideas. And as a test of this question about reporting research results, I can ask which of these two books changed the world? Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, in which he describes his travels through the Galapagos Islands, or the book that evolved out of that, The Origin of Species. Well, you couldn't get to The Origin of Species without his having written The Voyage of the Beagle first. He needed the data to give us the interpretations. But what really changed the way we think about the world is, of course, the interpretation. It's the story that Darwin wrote that grew out of the voyages. Or alternatively, we can ask which of these two things changed the world. This, photo 51, the structure of DNA from Rosalind Franklin. It's one of the most important pieces of raw data in the history of science. And yet, to me, it's just a piece of op art. I have no ability to interpret that whatsoever unless you explain it to me. Or Watson and Crick's pen and ink diagram of a structure of the structure of DNA. You can't get to there without there, but that explains how replication works. It explains heredity. It's understandable in terms of these ideas of the two interlocking chains. Again, it was the interpretation the interpretation of that X-ray crystallography image that allowed us to tell the story about DNA and why it's the molecule of heredity and how it works. So a paper doesn't only present our data, it interprets them, it tells the story. And when writing a paper, the critical thing is to always be thinking about, well, what is the story I'm trying to tell? And how do I do that? A paper tells a story about nature and how it works. This is the fundamental insight that isn't really all that surprising or exciting, but too many people ignore it. So a solid paper offers new actual knowledge, and a really important paper offers new understanding. And the greater the new understanding, the more important the paper will be. And of course, if we put photo 51 and Watson and Crick diagram, the real thing that they were aiming to explain was Mendelian genetics. So this only went so far, and they were very coy in the language they used in describing that they knew they did something important, and it was quite blatant, the language they were using. But ultimately, the real understanding is that next step of what DNA does for you. So again, I'll come back to this for a brief pause and take a quick swig of liquid while I'm doing that. So communication is not about what you give, but about what they get. And that means we need to think about 4 elements when we're thinking about communication. We need to think about the audience. Who is it we're talking to? What do they know? What do they value? How do I give that to them? We need to think about the story. We need to think about how we structure that story so as to deliver the story effectively. And we ultimately need to think about the language we use so that we're using language that will translate. So if we think briefly about audience, we write for different types of audiences, even when we're communicating within the scientific world. So sometimes we're writing for a specialist journal. This is most of what most of us write most of the time, where readers are experts in the field, and we can dive straight into those expert concepts without having to start at either the highest level or the lowest level, because we're writing for a group of people who speak our language. We don't have to translate into French if we're speaking to French speakers. Sometimes we're aiming a little bit higher than that. We're aiming for journals like Ecology or Cell, broad field journals that are drawing in a wider audience because we think we have a bigger, sexier story, where readers are still knowledgeable, but you have to start a little bit higher on the ladder of abstraction to draw them in. And sometimes, occasionally, we're lucky enough to get a story that is cool enough that we might want to aim for something like Nature, PNAS, or Science, where we can assume that the audience is smart, they're intelligent, but they're ignorant. We're trying to communicate to people who really don't speak our language, and that we need to then frame our story in larger, grander concepts. So the nature editor will look at it and go, I could imagine that going into my journal. I mean, the great cutoff point for getting things into things like Nature or PNAS is that editor doing that first cut triage. If they send your paper off for peer review, it fares much like a paper at any other journal. So you need to start much higher on the ladder of abstraction, show them why they should care, and then delve down into your specific language, but using as little of your own technical jargon as you can get away with. So, story structure, how you tell a story. There are a number of different story structures that exist in the world. All of them rely on certain core elements. Those elements are what I collapse into the acronym OCAR, which stands for Opening, Challenge, Action, Resolution. So all stories start with an opening where you set the place, you introduce the central characters, you give us a sense of where this story is, who it's about, and that tells us whether we should care or not. Are we engaged with those characters? Then there's a challenge. We have to find out what those characters have to do. What is it they're aiming to do to achieve the goals of the story? There's action where we actually see them doing that. And then there's a resolution. What did it all mean? How have the characters changed by going through this action, by meeting the challenge? How are they different at the end of the story than they were at the beginning of the story? The Lord of the Rings ends not with Frodo dropping the ring in the mountain of fire and saving the world, but with sailing off to Elvenhome, where we see how broken he was as a result of all of his trials and tribulations. The book wouldn't work as well without that kind of resolution, where we really see how these characters have changed, grown, and in some ways been damaged. So the resolution has to come back to the beginning, has to close the circle, it has to take us back to that initial place so we can see how it's different now. Now, that means that good storytelling is always circular. You always come back to the beginning at the end. But really, it's more of a spiral because the beginning has moved, and we need to see how the beginning has moved. How has our perception of the world changed as a result of what we've done through our writing? So in science, what does OCAR look like? The opening always is defining a problem. Whatever our first opening words are defining a scientific problem that's the large issue that we're contributing towards. And that's how you hook your audience. You say, here's a problem you care about. I have something to tell you about it. So maybe you want to read my paper or fund my proposal, which is equally important. Then there's a challenge. What is your specific question or specific hypothesis? What's the narrow, small thing you're actually doing? Then there's the action where we see how you went about answering the question. What's your data? What are your results? And finally, there's a resolution, which is the conclusion section of a paper. These are less important in a proposal where the story is really about what you're going to do. But even in a good proposal, you should still take a paragraph or two at the very end to wrap it all up, take it back to the beginning, and remind the reviewers how doing this work will help solve the problem you defined initially, will help answer the questions or hypotheses, and essentially what you want them to write on the review. Here's what this proposal is going to achieve. A good proposal ends with that paragraph. And that, oops. That resolution, again, always has to close back to the large issue. So let's look at some examples. So what about for proposals first? If you do it this way, where the punchline of the story happens at the end of the document, though, that story structure is not going to work for proposals, because proposals are sold on the first page or two. Dak Crosley once said, if you haven't told them in the first 2 pages, you haven't told them. In a paper, we want to follow along with you to find out what you have to offer, to find and to be able to sort of benchmark your story as it develops. With a proposal, we just want to figure out as quickly as we can whether or not to recommend the proposal for funding, or whether or not, in fact, this is something that's not going to cut it and we can just give it a good or a fair and be done with it. If you haven't told them in the first 2 pages, you haven't told them. Reviewers are doing triage, filtering the hopeful from the hopeless. And they're usually doing that pretty quickly, especially if they're on the panel and have a stack of reviews to get through. So there's another structure other than just this laying things out in the OCAR formula that works better for proposals. It still uses the same elements, but it organizes them a little bit differently. And that's what fiction writers call the ABDCE structure. ABDCE. I have a hard time. I use this so often that just going through the normal alphabet feels backwards to me now. in which you start with an opening action, which compresses the opening and the challenge into the first paragraphs of the text. So mystery novels often start this way, where you see the crime happening and you don't know anything about why it is or who it is, or then you stop and back up, give the background to fill them in, how we got there. Then you start moving forward again with the development, which is really the action, where we develop the action to a climax and to an ending. So this is in some ways less efficient about information flow, because you do have this step where you back up and fill people in on where you were. It's not all forward moving like the OCAR structure, but when you need to get things packaged quickly and abruptly, it works well, because you have both the opening and the challenge compressed into that initial opening section of the proposal. So, for example, this from Sue Grafton, C is for corpse, and I use her because she writes about Santa Barbara, though she gives it a different name. And this book opens with, I met Bobby Callahan on Monday of that week. By Thursday, he was dead. My name is Kinsey Malone. I'm a licensed private investigator. By the beginning of the second paragraph of the book, we already know who the central characters are, and we already know what the challenge is. Who is Bobby Callahan, and why is he dead? That's what the rest of the book is going to be about, and we know that on page 1. So it grabs your attention early on. That's the way you write research proposals. You grab them in the first paragraph or two. If here's a problem you care about, now I'm going to show you how we're going to solve that. And the rest of the proposal is just delivering on that initial promise. So as an example of sort of what this looks like in real writing, this is from the most highly cited paper I will ever write. And it says, from the late 1800s, nitrogen mineralization has been the perceived center point of the soil nitrogen cycle and the process that controls N availability to plants. And we can ask, so what is the problem that this identifies? And the answer is, the critical word there is perceived. It's a word that stands out and is a challenging word. And clearly, what the rest of the paper is going to talk about is that there's something wrong with that perception. If it isn't about that, then I wrote the first sentence wrong. In fact, it's very much about what's wrong with that perception. Is why the paper is the most highly cited thing I'll ever write. We can ask, who then is the target audience for this? And that's anyone who cares about nitrogen cycling. To tell people we've been thinking about the nitrogen cycle all wrong is a big, challenging statement. And so it's going to engage a wide audience of readers. Where would this have been published? Well, we published it in Ecology, because that's the kind of audience we were reaching for, an audience of a broad audience of ecologists who care about nitrogen cycling and care about how our ideas have developed the way they have. In contrast, I see lots of papers that look like this in soil biology and biochemistry, where it starts, in China, overuse of nitrogen-containing fertilizers has led to soil acidification and increased aluminum toxicity to crop plants. And we can ask here, what's the problem? And the problem is defined right up front as Chinese farmers use too much fertilizer. Well, we can ask, who's the target audience of this? Well, presumably it's Chinese agricultural scientists, because this is a story about Chinese fertilizer use. And we can ask, where was this be published? And I'll leave the question mark there. And what I will say is I see lots of these papers at Soil Biology and Biochemistry, and I can usually reject them based on the first words of the paper, because Soil Biology and Biochemistry is an international journal focusing on an international community of fundamental soil biologists and ecologists. So something that's specific and unique to China isn't our territory. But of course, everybody uses too much fertilizer. The farmers in this valley use too much fertilizer. The Chinese use too much fertilizer. The French do, the Germans do. Everybody uses enough fertilizer to cause environmental hazard problems. And you can study it anywhere to gain insights into the effect of those problems. but you need to write the paper so that it actually sells that larger story and isn't defined as the opening, the problem of the paper. It can't be just about Chinese agriculture. It has to be about something that someone else is going to care about. So they could have written this way. Overuse of nitrogen-containing fertilizers in global agriculture has led to widespread soil acidification and increased aluminum toxicity to crop plants. Now, this has a couple of keywords that twig that this is now an international problem. It's about a global agriculture and it's led to widespread soil acidification. You can study that now in any given location. There may be unique differences about how it operates in China versus in Utah, but it's at least defined as a global problem. And at the end of the paper, you'll have to come back to that and talk about how the specific study fits into the larger picture. But all it took was a brief reframing of the problem at the very beginning to make it a paper that, as an editor, I wouldn't reject based on the first words of the paper. I'd at least read further into the paper to see whether there was value and meaning here and whether or not it really fit within the purview of our journal. So now, this being the short version of the talk instead of the quarter-long course, I want to jump down and get into the weeds of language. And talk about when we're trying to tell a story, we're trying to hit the bullseye of that story. And there are two ways that you can ensure that you hit the bullseye of the dartboard that you're trying to hit with the story. One is you can learn to throw straight. Two, you can nail enough boards over all the rest of the dartboard that there's nothing left to hit except the bullseye. It's the only thing open. Qualifying, clarifying, subordinates, complex language, all the kind of things we nail up on our board, on our papers, so that we can't even really see what the board looks like anymore. Or worse, we can't even tell what dartboard we're talking about anymore. And I've definitely seen papers that have this kind of level of visual and writing complexity, so that you're just struggling to figure out what the hell are you trying to say. It can be quite the challenge. So this is the real opening from an abstract for a talk in our geography department a number of years ago. Our geography department is a top-rated department, so I'm sure whatever this person was talking about was actually really cool, cutting-edge geography. But the writing raises some issues, and I'll read it. Access to information is necessary, but not sufficient in our digital era. The challenge is to objectively integrate digital resources based on user-defined objectives for the purpose of discovering information relationships that facilitate interpretations and decision-making. And the abstract went on for half a page reading like this. And I'll pose the question of, is this hard to read because the material is fundamentally hard or because the writing is hard? And I'll do a quick poll of how many people actually understand what this is trying to say. Yeah, this is the typical response. Everyone's going, I don't know what that means. So academic language has several bad habits, and that was as perfect an example of just about all of them in one piece of writing as anything I've ever seen. And someday I'm desperately paranoid that I'm going to run into the person who wrote it, and we're going to have a conversation, but I'll stand by my judgment. The writing is poor, even if the science is strong. We avoid action verbs. We hide the action. We hide it behind nominalizations and other kinds of writing tools. We use a lot of nominalizations, which is taking a verb and turning it into a noun. We like lots of big fancy words, Latin-derived words, French-derived words, instead of nice, good old-fashioned Anglo-Saxon words. We like Latin words because we want to show off our vocabulary.
No, you can turn it off.
So I'll come back to this and I'll ask the question, where is the action? Any good story has action. And somewhere in here, there must be some kind of action. Yet when you read it, it seems remarkably devoid of action. And here are all the verbs that are expressing action. Someone's accessing information. Somebody is being challenged. Someone's integrating digital resources. Someone's defining objectives. Someone's discovering user information relationships. Someone is making interpretations. Someone's making decisions. There's a lot of action going on in this little piece of text.
About science.
But it's not visible.
To help me become better.
And the reason it's not visible is because we can then ask the question of, well, if someone's doing all this action, where's the actor? There is no actor. Nobody's doing it. It's completely invisible as to who is doing what in this piece of text. So it's nowhere. The person's completely hidden behind language tools that allow you to mask the actor. And sometimes that's valuable. You know, when mom walks in and sees a broken dish on the plate and asks, well, who broke the dish? I don't know, mom, somehow it got broken. You know, you don't want to talk about who the actor is. Language has tools to do that. Can talk about it just got broke. I don't know who happened. It wasn't that I was, playing tag in the middle of the kitchen with somebody. We can also then ask, as we go into the technical tools of how we actually communicate the language, where are the verbs? Because verbs are what are supposed to express action. That's the very purpose of a verb in the English language. And we can ask, where are the verbs? And there are actually 5 of them. There's one is right up top. There's an is right there. There's a to objectively integrate, which is a split infinitive, which some people still say you shouldn't do in English. But the reason they say you shouldn't do it in English is because it's impossible to do in Latin. And if you can't do it in Latin, you shouldn't do it in English, which is complete bogus logic. English is not the same language. There's nothing wrong with split infinitives. There's a gerund here, the discovering, an ing verb, which is not very verby. And there's that facilitate, which is a heavy Latinate derived verb, as is integrate. So the verbs are really, really weak. And they're not well connected to expressing the actions. There's lots of actions up here that are not expressed in verbs. And verbs are how we show action. Verbs are powerful. I always tell people in my writing class, you've got to fall in love with verbs. This is how you achieve better writing, and how the structural language issue in the book that I'm thinking of, that I've just lost the name of, talks about. So we can rewrite this to condense out the unnecessary language. We can rewrite it to convert some of these terms into things that fit better, and they try to get rid of some of the lost action terms that don't have an actor involved. And so we come up with a first version of this text that reads, access to information is necessary, but not sufficient. The challenge is to integrate digital information to discover relationships that allow clear interpretation and better decision-making. Or we can take it another step and actually introduce the actor and say, access to information is necessary, but not sufficient. The challenge is to integrate digital information to discover relationships that allow us to interpret the data more clearly and to make better decisions. So this introduces this one little extra character, us, and that's the reason you might think twice about this, because the question could be, well, who is us? Is us the authors? Or is us this more generic community of authors and readers? And I think pretty obviously here that this is not just the authors, but this version, I think now you read and you go, I think I start to understand what these guys are doing. Where that first initial version, nobody raised their hand for. How many people can read this version and think they have some sense of what these authors are trying to do? Yeah, and all you had to do was fix the very clear and somewhat obvious, once you know how to look for them, problems with the writing of too much jargon, too weak characters, some extra verbiage, a couple of things that you can actually teach people how to fix. So there's no difference in the intellectual content, but the message becomes clearer and shorter. And when you're dealing with 15-page limits on, say, NSF proposals, I mean, I remember getting a proposal to review once where the first page was wall to wall, top to bottom, just gray text, the entire thing. And my initial reaction was very clear and very strong. And it was very, very unfavorable. It was like, okay, I hate you. I'm going to have to read 15 pages of this. And I hate you. And you want me to give this an excellent and fight on your behalf. But you've done nothing to earn my support. So when you have page limits, learning how to condense and collapse the language down into the shortest possible format, this is much shorter than the original version, as well as being much clearer, becomes not only just a desirable trait, it becomes a survival strategy of how to write proposals that the reviewing panel will look at and get the messages and get the excitement, and will get in your corner, so that when the discussion opens up at the NSF review panel, they're going to say, yeah, I think that we should fund this, and I'm willing to, sit here and stomp on the table about it and argue on behalf of this person who I probably don't even know. But I think that they did something cool enough that I'm willing to fight on their behalf. That's what it takes to get a proposal funded, especially at a place like NSF, where funding rates can be 5, 10, 15, 20%, but rarely you're going to go higher than that. And you're competing against pretty stiff competition. If you write like, this version, you're dead in the water, even if your ideas are really terrific, which I suspect they were in this document. But if you can't write it like this one, you're in trouble. So I'll wrap up with just a couple of last thoughts, and we have some time for questions, I think, and I hope. Communication isn't what you give or what you think you're giving. It's what the readers actually get. It's whatever message they assimilate. Well, that's what you communicated. And if that is the heavy, cumbersome, nominalization-laden writing, that's the wrong messaging. And you can learn how to write clearer, cleaner English. So communication is not what you give, but it's what they get. And so I'll end with this quote from David Crystal in his book, Making a Point, which is, so the important thing, the really important thing, is to be aware of what the options are. Writing science is telling stories about nature, and we have choices to make in terms of how we structure those stories, how we write the language, how we organize components, how we use words and the choices we make in our word choice, but that there are principles that are straightforward, if not easy, and that are learnable, that any of us can use to do a better job of writing and to be a more clear, more effective, more compelling communicator. And that they are, as I say, learnable. It sometimes takes unlearning habits that we've acquired through years of school and years of writing things and handing them in and getting grades on them, but never having to come back and revisit what we wrote and having to do that kind of self-editing that is actually the guts of real writing. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. I hope we have some time for questions. Oh.
All right, we have time for some questions. Also, we will put the address up. There will be a social immediately